Todd, welcome back to the podcast.
Scott, it's always great to be here with you.
It's a thrill to have you. I think the last time I had you on was around Christmas with your colleague Ryan talking Christmas movies. People loved that show. People were really, as the religious community say, blessed by that endeavor. A lot of people had many appreciative comments and helped.
Well, that's nice.
Their holiday.
I love
watching.
Christmas movies almost as much as Hegel. So,
well, there you go. Now, so this is my. So I had a professor. And by the way, what we're talking about, folks, which you'll obviously read in the show notes, is Todd's Hegel book, Emancipation After Hegel, Achieving a Contradictory Revolution. One of the best books. I don't say this lightly. I read a lot of books, and I have a lot of guests on the show. And this is one of the more important books I've read in a while. It was really helpful, and I learned a ton. So I'm excited to talk about it. Now, I had a professor who his name was Tony Campolo. He became pretty prominent. He was a progressive evangelical. He became pretty prominent during the Bill Clinton-Lewinsky scandal because he was one of the clergy people that Clinton brought in to counsel him. But he had decades of history as an evangelical activist and helping him fight for social justice and empowering the poor and things, and was also a sociology professor. And Tony was a sought-after speaker hundreds of times a year. And he said that, he flew all the time. And he said when somebody when he was on the plane and he wanted to talk, they'd say, how are you? I'm Tony, you're Mark. What do you do for a living? He said, if I want to talk, I'd say, I'm a sociologist. And they'd say, oh, that's very interesting. And they would talk. He said, no, if I wanted to sleep, I would say, I'm a Baptist evangelist. And then the person would just turn the other way and talk to the other person. So I can imagine, if you, I don't know, if you said Hegel in the airplane or the elevator, I mean, maybe
they would turn the other way.
Yeah,
yeah.
But how would you, if somebody said, if you wanted to get someone into Hegel, if you wanted to have the conversation where you wanted to talk, and somebody asked you, well, what do you do? And you wanted to bring up Hegel, how in the elevator, how in the airplane, how would you make this something that someone without a strong background, that didn't know much or anything about Hegel and certainly didn't know why it's important, what would your elevator, airplane, lounge, seat speech be?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think anyone's ever asked. I've been asked probably 1,000 questions about Hegel and never this one.
This is why you come on this show, for questions like this.
So that's pretty great. Because the people that come to me, right? So they come to me because they think that I know something about Hegel, and so I don't have to sell them. In fact, I have to try to help them wind their way through the difficulties. What would I say? I think here's how I would do it. And I would say, do you know that there's this German philosopher who talks about the way that we live our lives in a philosophical way that we are not aware of, and yet we're really living out. So I think that's what I'd probably say. Or if the person was, and it touches on your Baptist minister thing, if the person was Christian, I'd say, oh, Hegel is the one philosopher who has a really kind of cool idea of how to understand Christianity philosophically. So I often, and this separates me. So I talk about this in the book. There's this split between left and right Hegelians, and the left Hegelians, which is pretty much most of my friends, they really emphasize Hegel's, he's not invested in the afterlife. He was Christian, but not in the sense that people mostly are today. So they really de-emphasize the any relationship to Christianity that Hegel had. And one of the things that I do in this book is really emphasize that, right? Like that's really important to me. So I think that's what I would say if I knew the person had that kind of interest. But if I didn't know that, I think I would try to talk about what I just said. But I think I would also try to say, there's this really, there's this fascinating philosophical idea called dialectics. And it's basically invented by this guy Hegel. And the idea is that it's a little like the butterfly effect. Like everything that we do, everything that we interact with has an effect on everything else. And that relationship is often leads, or necessarily leads, Hegel thinks, to contradictions, and these contradictions drive our activity. So whenever you think you've hit some kind of obstacle or roadblock, Hegel would say, well, this is in a way necessary for you, and we should look at it through the other side of the looking glass. So that's not a very great pitch, I don't think, but something like that, I think, would be. But I, to be honest, what often happens to me is I'll be reading a book, either on Hegel or by Hegel, and someone will say, "What is that?" on a plane or a train or whatever. I don't really fly anymore, so usually on or bus or whatever in a dentist's office.
You're taking buses in Vermont?
No, I don't really take a bus, so I just.
No,
drive
I take
everywhere.
buses like almost every day. I live.
I know. I don't really take a bus.
I'm on public.
I just was saying
I'm
that.
one of the. I mean,
Yeah.
You talk about the importance of the public in a lot of your work.
Yeah, I know. So I should
live
take
in
buses.
the public. I live in the public every day, man, and I take so many like echinacea and vitamin C because the subways in Philadelphia are petri dishes. It's just disgusting.
No, I'm sure
it's
that's
disgusting with germs. But
yeah.
But I'm in the public, buddy. I'm in the public.
Yeah. So anyway, yeah, it's not so just a whatever doctor's office, dentist's office. So someone will say to me, "Oh, what is Hegel? What is that?" And so then I'll try to explain in the way that I just did. So I'll try to talk about dialectics because I think that's something that everybody can. Like the term sounds foreboding, but I think it's pretty accessible when you break it down. So
one of the things I got from your book was this idea that contradiction is everywhere. And Hegel, most philosophers say contradiction, bad.
It's impossible, right? I mean, that's the thing, right?
People don't, the philosophers want to make it go away, right? Like just spell it away, tease it out, fix it, make it go away. And for Hegel, there's only contradictions, right? Philosophy is, no matter how basic the statement is. And you give some examples. I thought of an example from my life years ago. I was living in Pittsburgh. I was a young seminarian, and I was driving by the liberal sort of Presbyterian cathedral, but I repeat myself. And this firebrand liberal preacher, his sermon for the week, which was on the signboard, was, "An inclusive church isn't for everybody."
That's great.
But that's you have these examples in the book, right, where somebody says, "I'm for universal tolerance," and then you tease it out, and nobody can be right. Within the most simple statements, right? What you're teasing out through Hegel is that there's always internal contradiction. That no matter how basic you think something is, you dig a little bit, right, and there's contradiction everywhere to be found.
Right. So that's his idea, and that's why he thinks philosophy has to be systematic, because if you stay within the little statement, or if you think, like one of Hegel's most famous critics is Bertrand Russell, who thought Hegel was a spouter of nonsense. And Russell was an atomist. So he thought we should take every statement in isolation and never think about it in relation to a systematic whole. And Hegel's point would be, well, then you miss the way, if you do that, you don't do what you just did, which was you took that statement and thought about it dialectically and extended it out in relation to the whole. And then you saw, oh, it ends up being contradictory. And and Hegel's idea is that's true. And this is one of the things that's probably controversial about the book, so someone like Immanuel Kant would say that about our reason, right? That our reason, if we take it too far, it's always going to be contradictory. But Hegel says, well, actually, it's true about things in the world too. That if they weren't contradictory, then then we wouldn't ourselves be contradictory. That's his conclusion. And so it's this kind of crazy idea, but I think it's interesting because I think he, in a way, I don't talk about this in the book, but in a way he anticipates 20th century physics, right? Like the way in which right now you and I are talking and we're constantly becoming other because the molecules in our body are right. Like he didn't even know what a molecule was, but they're like, we're losing some, we're gaining others. Like we're constantly other to ourselves. And so that's I think kind of captures nicely what Hegel's project is, this way in which we have to see, and that's what's contradictory. We have to see ourselves in what's absolutely different from us.
You talk about in the book in one section about Freud and how Hegel, predates Freud, but oh my gosh, had he been able to read Freud, because it just extends it all the way down, because through Freudian psychoanalysis and everything that comes in its wake, now we see how conflicted we are, right? It's almost an obvious kind of point, right? That Hegel has this pre-Freud, right?
Right. It's amazing. I was just talking to a group yesterday, and someone said, "Is Freud post-Hegelian or is Hegel pre-Freudian?" Right? And I think that's a really interesting question, that, because Freud didn't know Hegel, and obviously Hegel didn't know Freud because Freud wasn't even alive when Hegel died. But it is an interesting question, because I think the proper answer is Hegel really anticipates what psychoanalysis is going to discover, right? It's not an influence on Freud, really. Not at all. But I think that for exactly the reason you just said, is that Freud, by discovering the unconscious, discovers exactly how we are contradictory to ourselves, because we haven't. This is the most common example, right? You're trying to say one thing, and then you slip and say the exact opposite, and sometimes you ruin your. I once sort of ruined a relationship with my girlfriend because I kept calling her the name of my former girlfriend, and she was like, "Okay, that's enough," right? So that's that. I think.
Did you? Or were you? Did you want out of it? And you didn't even know. I
did. Yeah. And actually, it took a while for it to end. So I should have obeyed my unconscious and got out of it. So I think that's. I think that's you're right to say that Hegel gets really concretized in the Freudian notion of the unconscious, because then the contradiction with ourselves is absolutely apparent, right?
So you in the book talk about, I remember years ago I was listening to a podcast called Entitled Opinions that comes out of Stanford or something. This guy, Robert Harrison or something, a Dante scholar, but great intellectual podcast. And he had someone on there once, and the only thing I remember from the interview is the guy was into Hegel, and he said in some kind of European accent, he said, somebody once said to me that learning logic from Hegel is like taking culinary tips from Jeffrey Dahmer. And this is what a lot of people like Bertrand Russell, right? A lot of folks in the Philosophical Academy would think. But you say one of the things that Hegel does is he brings together logic, the kind of thinking rules of the road, with ontology, like what really is, right? When oftentimes philosophy separates these things out, right? Logic, we discreetly put this over here, and this is how we avoid contradiction, and it's not A, and this sort of stuff. And what Hegel and ontology we think of as, well, what's really real, what's there, metaphysics. You're saying Hegel says, no, we can't separate these things, right? That logic and ontology are dialectically related. They're flip sides of a coin, which we can't parse out so neatly.
Right, exactly. So he called his second major book, The Science of Logic, he called it an analysis of the mind of God before creation. So it is, there's a major ontological claim about, obviously, just from the way he put that, that he wants to make, because his idea is, it's not, so it seems stupid, I think, to people like the person that you heard, because obviously we can have thoughts that aren't the same as what's really real, right? Like you and I we probably even today, we had a little, whatever, not even an obscene fantasy, but just some kind of fantasy. Oh, I wish that, whatever, Canada won the football match today, or whatever it was, right? And it didn't happen. I don't know if they won or not, but it didn't happen, right? So that seems like it's a crazy statement to say logic is ontology. But what Hegel means by that is that there are certain kinds of possibilities that are both enabled and obstructed by the world, and that creates the path through which logic develops if it's systematic. So that's why the philosophers that hate Hegel to come back to Russell, they hate systematizing, and they hate the idea of thinking the totality, because they want to deal with everything in isolation, and they think that objects are isolatable from each other, right? Like to me, that's the great anti-Hegelian push, is to see things and objects in isolation. And you can also see how that's I don't mean to accuse Bertrand Russell of being a capitalist. I think he was a good socialist, but it's a very capitalist way of thinking. Like I'm just this isolated being, and whatever, I don't have to worry about whatever the effect of what I do. But Hegel's, his whole philosophy is worrying about the effects of what you do, and thinking about how what is connected to what it's possible for me to think. And so that's what the logic is really about.
And on the logical point, the basic thing, you have this great section in the book where you talk about, or towards the beginning of the book where you're talking about, like the basic, if you get into undergraduate philosophy, right, you're just going to learn basic logic. You'll learn like, A is not A, right? Like the things are, the things are this thing is, and it's not this. It is this because it's not this. And you come along and say, no, this whole A and not A, this sort of stuff, this basic building block of logic that you learn as an undergraduate, no, right? That the law of non-contradiction, all this basic stuff that you learn as an intrepid thinker as an undergrad, all of this Hegel says, no, right? That we've got to walk back these assumptions.
Right, absolutely. So the A equals A is a really good one, right? This law of identity. And this comes maybe from Aristotle. It's questionable whether Aristotle actually said it, but it's definitely in Leibniz. And you're right. It's a sort of basic assumption of philosophy that if you say A, then it must be equal to A, right? Right. It has to be, right? And if the idea is if you reject that, then you reject thinking as such, right? You can't say anything. You become Donald Trump, who can say, every foreign, I'm not going to start any foreign wars, and then you just start a foreign war, right? So it's just right. Anything goes. But Hegel's ideas, well, even in the positing of A equals A, that some kind of difference is asserted. Otherwise, you wouldn't have to make the statement A equals A. So his idea is that every statement of identity also includes some difference within it. And once you say that, then I think what's most interesting to me, and this is maybe why I even wrote the book, I don't know why you do anything, but is the political dimension of that. Because you have to see the way in which, for him, you're dependent on the thing that you think the minister that you talked about, right? That had the ministry of inclusion isn't for everyone, right? Like that, the way in which you need that figure of the outsider or the enemy or the adversary, that is so essential to his philosophy, because his point is that the A equals A depends upon some slight difference in that you are pushing off against in order to establish your own identity. So for him, I think they're just even in this is what I think is most, to me, exciting about his thought. So logic is ontology, but logic is also politics, because there's a way in which you see that the political dimension of being able to think this identity of the thing that's identical and of difference. Like all of a sudden that it reduces that gap that you have between yourself and the enemy. Or I always like to think of the movie Alien, and you have to think of this horrible, disgusting alien, and I have to think I am that thing, which is this is why Alien 3 is my favorite one, when Sigourney Weaver realizes she herself is the alien, right? Like that's the I think the most Hegelian moment in that series. And I think that really captures his philosophy better than almost anything.
So you're saying, because if you can see that, right? If you can see this dialectical relationship and everything, are you saying that it makes you someone I guess the big sort of boogeyman in 20th century philosophy or ethics is othering, right? That you make someone other, and then by making them other, they're an object, not a subject, right? There's something you can do stuff to, or manipulate, or put on a shelf or something. It's harder to do that with a subject, right? Martin Buber, the I thou is different than an I it, right? And so what you're saying is somehow Hegel's philosophy gets you a lot closer to I thou and takes you away from I it.
Well, I think what it does is it shows you how the it is necessary for your constitution as an I, right? Like,
okay,
it's not that you see that whatever the other is. Like, I think he doesn't think you really relate to the other as a subject, because I don't think he thinks that's possible. But I think he does think that you relate to that other as an object that is essential to you, right? Like, you can't have this radical cleft between yourself and the other. And I think that for him is that's essential to his thinking. But that goes for everything, right? It doesn't just go for other people. It goes for the whole world. Like, you can't, like, you're constituted by everything that's around you for him, and you're constantly made by that. And so that's what his philosophy forces you to take into account, which I think that to me is the radical step that he takes, which I don't think I know no one else before him thought, and I think sadly few people after him have thought as well. So the story before him, right? If you pick up with like Descartes and Kant, and is, I guess, something more like this: I'm the subject here, and the whole world is out there, and it's other, and I'm sort of trying my best to connect with that thing, right? I've got to figure out whether you're Descartes and you're trying to figure out what can I trust, and my sense is reliable to get out there, or Kant and thinking, how can I know that what I'm experiencing out there seemingly is what this guy is, so we can do science. But it starts with this problem, right? Which Hegel says, no, that you're already more related to the thing you're trying to know than you think, right? That it's not it's not this tragic sort of, maybe it's tragic, but it's not something that's where there's a fixed boundary. Scott is exactly right. So the Kantian idea of that split between appearances and things in themselves, that's exactly what Hegel rejects, because he doesn't think that anything is that much other to you as a thing in itself, right? Like, you're already, even by categorizing it as a thing in itself that you cannot access. For he famously says, to know a limit is already to be beyond the limit. This is a critique of Kant. So his idea is you're already interacting with that thing in itself, even if you're just saying we can't know it. That's a way of knowing it. So there's not what he really is against, and this is his Christian critique of Judaism, right, and of Islam. That by positing God, like in Judaism, you can't even say God's real name, right? You have to say that basically God's nickname, Adonai. And for Hegel, that's the problem, right? Like, that's the problem, because it puts God in this place of the beyond as this thing that's as this being that's inaccessible to us, and God moves in mysterious ways, whatever. But his idea, and that's what he loves about Christianity, is that in Christianity, God is down to earth in the most humiliated possible position, the death on the cross. That removes that Christianity is. That's why I think it's so central to his philosophy, because it's a way of getting rid of that beyond, and it's the first religion he thinks that does that subtracts any idea of the beyond. So Kant was very much more a Christian than Hegel probably, but his critique of Kant is that Kant is really too Jewish of a thinker, right? That by making this thing in itself beyond our possible experience, that's a way of sort of reestablishing this God of the beyond that he wants to get rid of, because he doesn't think for him there isn't a beyond, right? Like because if there was a beyond, we wouldn't even be able to, there might be a beyond, but we wouldn't be able to talk about it. And we would have we would not have any knowledge of the fact that there's a beyond that we're not accessing. So that for him is the crucial point, which leads him to talk about the totality, the whole.
Now, I do want to ask you, I want to get more into some of this, but I want to ask a qualifying question here. You, in your chapter where you talk a little bit explicitly about his relationship with, I mean, the whole book talks about his relationship with Christianity, but you talk about his early conception of Christianity and Judaism and what he moves on to. How does he evolve? Because you talk about a sort of more, there's a mature appreciation as for Christianity that's a little different than the early reflections on Christianity.
Yeah, so Hegel is one of these interesting thinkers that once he establishes his system in 1807, for the last 25 years of his life, he doesn't change it at all. But you draw attention to this point, which I think is really crucial, that in the late 1790s, late 1790s, he has this idea of, and this is an idea he had pretty much through the 90s. That he was at the seminary with Hölderlin and Schelling. They were three roommates and friends, and I think they probably all had this idea, but Hegel's the one that really thinks it through the most. Is that he was very critical of Christianity, and he had this fantasy of helping to develop what he called a folk religion akin to the pagan Greek religion, right? So he thought that in some way that religion grew more out of the people and wasn't this thing that was positive, or he called it in the essay, he calls it the positivity, the Christian religion. And for him, positivity is a curse word. That's a bad thing. It's this thing that's imposed upon people with a positive doctrine that they just have to obey and recite, right? Like the the Nicene Creed or Apostles' Creed or something. And so he has this idea up to a certain point in the I think it's like 1799, he changes his mind. And it's interesting because I talk about this in the book. I think it's around this time he has his first sexual partner, and he writes her a letter, interestingly, and he says, I've decided I'm no longer going to try to change the world. Instead, it's this great line. He says, I'm going to howl with the wolves, and I'm going to adopt Christianity what he does is he stops thinking, oh, I got to reform the world religiously. And instead, I'm going to look at Christianity and see if that has something to say philosophically. And so that's the moment. So it's very early, and he's just about to turn 30. That's the moment when he changes his mind. And then he writes this essay called The Spirit of Christianity, in which his mind is totally changed. And in that essay, in the early essay, Positivity of Christian Religion, he sees Christianity and Judaism as just exactly the same, no difference. And then in The Spirit of Christianity, he separates them. And then that's the key move, because he's able to see the way in which what Christianity, it comes to him, this philosophical idea. And love is important in understanding this, because love, I think I say this in the book, that love is what his early understanding of love becomes how he understands the concept, which is a kind of, again, we talked about how the philosophy professors wouldn't like that. That's something they wouldn't like at all, because you can't, love is an emotion, and the concept is the heart of rationality, right? So they can't, how could they be linked? But that's one of the things that he does, is he links Christian love to conceptual thinking in this, I think, amazing tour de force. And that becomes that's the moment where his attitude to Christianity totally changes.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm thinking of a book called Theology and Social Theory by a guy named John Milbank. And the first sentence of that book, I don't know if you know this book.
I don't know the book, but I know John Milbank.
Yeah, Milbank. I read a lot of Milbank in graduate school, and I I thought this book, I mean, this guy's British. His English reads like a bad translation. I mean, and he's a native English speaker. But, but the prose is sometimes torturous. But an interesting thinker. But in Theology and Social Theory, he said, it's a massive tome, and he says that basically modernity is an ontology of violence. That economics is scare. It's not about the goods we have in common. It's about scarcity and managing scarcity. Politics isn't coming together to seek high goods or something like maybe Aristotle could see it, or something classical. It's managing competing egoisms, right? And so it's interesting because on one level, I think Milbank would throw Hegel under the bus in with all these people. This is all modernity, and it's all, the alienated subject and Freudian this and that, the Nietzsche conflict. And for him, the answer is, I don't know, going back to something like Neoplatonism or something, which is probably not. But your Hegel's a little more complicated than that, right? That this while the dialectic and the contradiction is, there is also this running under this theme of love, right? And relationality, right? And the fact that this contradiction is not necessarily, you couldn't just neatly put it in ontology of violence, that it's more complex than that.
No, in fact, I think it's Hegel's way of trying to get beyond that violence, because there's something always violent about but for him the violence is more an internal violence to ourselves, and that when we don't avow that, then we visit it on the other. I think he would say that, and I think that the idea of love, so his idea is that, why would love be contradictory, right? Because in love, you value the other more than yourself, right? But why is it contradictory? Because you're the source of the valuation of the other, right? So it's this nice way in which love is self-undermining, because you're the one who values the other more than yourself, but you're the one doing it. So that if you're not valued, then the other can't have its greater value than you. So that's that contradiction at the heart of love. And then he extends that. He thinks all conceptual thinking works the same way, because it reaches out of itself toward the other, and it tries to include the other, but then it ultimately can't. And the very fact that it can't is what makes it, what sustains it. And I think that's true of love as well, right? Like if you really, everyone's felt this, right? Like if you try to win, let's say you try to win someone's heart, and if you really win it, if you get their total devotion, I think there's a movie about, it's too scary for me to watch, but I think there's a movie about this out right now called Obsession, where the woman totally goes for the guy and won't leave him alone at all. And it's a horror movie. It becomes horrible. And I think so love has to sustain. It wants the person to be devoted to us, but it also wants the person to be, in a way, not devoted to us. So that's that's the same way that conceptual thinking works. Like, I want to include this thing within my concept, but if it doesn't resist my concept in some way, then it's not something that distinct that I can put under my concept. So that's what it's this, I think, an amazing way of rethinking how conceptual thinking operates under the aegis of love as the model for it.
It's interesting the way you just tease that out about the it's got to be it's got to relate to my concept, and it's got to be kind of other than the conceptual framework for it to be real, or else it just gets swallowed up. I think there's so many times in the book where I think that you tease out things which I think become intuitive if you think about them enough, right? But at face value, they seem counterintuitive, right? The dialectical contradictory Hegel just seems, this is why I think, as you point, a lot of philosophers just pull their hair out and just, are cutting off or squaring the circle at all these kinds of points and trying to lop off things, or, we got to get rid of the state. We got to get rid of the Christianity. We got to get rid of, but I think what you are often saying is, if you hang in there with this, it actually does more justice to human experience than at first glance, right, might be true.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. I mean, that's why I loved your initial question about the airline thing, because I think it's hard because I think you're right. Like, it's so immediately counterintuitive that it's hard to get past that first step of saying to someone, okay, right, like, think this, you just got to just hang with it and think this through. And then it actually helps to make more sense of, because I think if you think about it, I think a lot of thinkers have trouble with the concept. Like they don't, it's hard for them because the concept, they become afraid of it because they're like, the concept reduces everything to the same, right? Because it just, you fit something under the concept and then it loses its difference. But Hegel has a way, because he thinks of it on the model of love, that's not a problem for him. That it doesn't really eliminate the difference of the thing it's thinking. It thinks itself and what's other to it as identical. So it's this identity and difference together. And so, yeah, I do think ultimately it is intuitive, but it has to get past a real, I think, immediate barrier that we have to thinking in that way. So it's really, I think, a very hard thing to introduce to people. And he's a really bad writer too, so that doesn't help the situation.
There's so much, it's interesting that Karl Barth, in his history of 19th century theology, or these lectures he gave on 19th century theology, I think at Basel, and he has this great little section on Hegel. And Barth has this really interesting relationship with Hegel. I mean, he says, it's permitted for theologians to do a little Hegeling now and then. But he says something really interesting. He says, it's just miraculous. It's so astounding that Hegel didn't become the Protestant Thomas Aquinas. That he wasn't, Aquinas becomes this great synthesizer, right, of the Bible and Christian theology, subsequent or that came before Aristotle, and then he brings Aristotle in and reworks the thing and creates this massive synthesis, right? Where and Barth says, why didn't Hegel become that for Protestants? Where Hegel could have, with this Lutheran, and Luther has this dialectic right at the beginning of his theology, right? He says, no, it's not what the Catholics are telling you, that one minute you're a sinner and the next moment you're a saint, right? You go in and get your reconciliation, and now you're on the sainthood line. And no, you've become a sinner again. Now you got to go get sacramental grace. Luther says, no, it's always the same time. You're always living in both. Simul justus et peccator. We're all at the same time sinner and saint. It's the ultimate dialectic, right? Luther's flipping the whole Catholic thing on its head and saying, no, we all inhabit both spaces. We're all sinners and saints all the time, all the way down. That's it. Why didn't Hegel become the Protestant Thomas? Why, when you go to Protestant seminaries, why wasn't I taught as a young seminarian, you, son, need to learn your Hegel like Catholics need to learn their Aquinas?
Yeah, I think I know the answer to that. And I think it's because, so there's this great moment. Heinrich Heine, who was a great student of Hegel's, probably his best student, was at a party with Hegel Heine recounts this years later, was at a party with Hegel one evening. They were standing outside and Heine looked up at the stars and he said, isn't it nice to think that up in the sky there we have our eternal reward for our, he was imagining this, some kind of metaphor for heaven. And which is odd because Heine was a Jew and Jews don't necessarily believe in heaven. But Hegel goes, what's the problem? He goes, you want a tip for being nice to your brother and not poisoning your old mother or something like that. Like he wasn't sanguine about the notion of an eternal reward. And I think that makes it very hard for a thinker like that to fit in. Someone like Kierkegaard, that's the whole game for him, really, right? And for Pascal too. I think those thinkers, even though they're philosophically more limited, because they're invested in precisely this promise of eternity in a way that Hegel just isn't. I think that's why they, ironically, have much more is this an adjective, seminarial traction than Hegel does. Because I think that really, I mean, maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's just I've always felt that way. I've always felt that his really just scorn for the idea of eternal life makes it, he really believed in God in his way, but God had come down to earth, and then he loved this idea of wherever two or three are gathered in my name, there I am, right? And so the fact that he uses the term spirit for his to talk about basically our collective intelligence, it's not an accident, and it's the same. It's the term in German is for Holy Ghost is Heilige Geist, and the term that just predominates in his philosophy is Geist or spirit. So I think that he likes that dimension. He doesn't like the dimension of salvation so much. So I guess that would be my answer. I don't know. I mean, your answer would probably be better than mine on this.
I mean, that is interesting. Like, hey, we got Christianity, but let's take out the salvation part. I mean, you still got the potlucks.
Right. No, right. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean,
you really have those. I mean,
right.
that's the whole thing for him then, right? The potlucks, right? Like that's that establishment of the religious community that is salvation in a way for him.
And you don't talk that much, a little bit, but I mean, you don't talk that much you talk about the cross a lot and the death of God a lot, but not so much Trinitarian theology. And as you're talking, I'm thinking for Hegel, the Trinity seems to become almost something linear and historical, right? You start with Father, right? And that's the sort of most primitive form of because the God is out there, right? The reality, it's out there.
Absolutely right.
And then the Son is closer, right? Because it's the dialectic, it's the God and death, it's this, what's more opposite, the God and death and being and non-being, and then you're really in the dialectic. But that once you get that gives way to spirit, right? Once you can get to that contradiction, then you can get the spirit, right? Where you can have agency and freedom and recognition and understanding and tease out contradictions. So Father, Son, and Spirit doesn't become these things that are in some eternal dance, right? Like in the Trinitarian, like in the Eastern Orthodox icons or something. But there are these phases, right, where spirit is the telos, the end game.
Yeah, I think that's very good. Yeah, and you're right. I don't talk about that in that way in the book, but I think that's the way I would talk about it. Yeah.
But there's another way. So as I was reading, there's another thing that was rattling around in my head, because there's something. I had a teacher in graduate school, Bruce McCormick, who used to great Barth scholar and great scholar of 19th century Protestant liberalism, but he would say he hated Trinitarian theology as philosophy or as ontology. There's this book that a guy, Colin Gunton, wrote called The One, the Three, and the Many, that said that, I remember the first sentence of that book was something like that Western culture is the struggle between Heraclitus and Parmenides, right? And all this. And he hated it. He said, all the Trinity is to explain the cross, right? That's it. To explain how God can die. And then any speculation is no good. But there is something about this Trinitarian stuff, right? That you even hear like Athanasius and these church fathers say that the Father is not the Father without the Son, right? That these determinate negation happens, that you kind of, and so there is some of that in Hegel, right? You could have a conversation about Trinitarian stuff, right? Because there's no, as in the Trinity, there's no ultimate starting point that's discrete and absolute apart from the others. You kind of have this in Hegel, right? That it's almost a Trinitarian lens in reality, that once you think you see something independent, you're probably missing something.
You're missing it, right? No, it's exactly right. And I think this is my coming up book on Hegel, but I think it's because of the role that retroactivity plays in him, right? So it's almost like it's only when we have the community of the Spirit that we can even recognize the figure of the Father, right? So that's why that gives the lie to the chronological version of the Trinity. And I think, the first line of John captures the fact that you can't separate the Son from the Father, right? Like that the birth of the Son is in some way coterminous with the emergence of the Father or the eternity of the Father, right? And so I think that that what you're saying is exactly right. That while that chronological thing is a nice heuristic, there's something misleading about it for Hegel, because you always see everything is always there at once, and it's exposed retroactively. So we see backwards into what had to have been to have us to come to the position that we're at. And I think, to me, this is the biggest split. And I think one of the saddest things since Hegel died is that he became this philosopher of forward-moving progressive history. I think that's just completely wrong. Completely. I think it's in part due to the Marxist, the way that we associate Hegel as a forerunner of Marx, and then he gets reduced to this idealist version of Marx's materialist history. But I just think that has no, even in the philosophy of history, it's where we get to that allows us to see where we've come from, right? So where we've come from only makes sense it's not like a teleological movement. It's a retroactive movement where you see backwards what had to be the conditions of possibility so that we got to where we are. It's the same thing we were talking about, logic and ontology, right? So it's not that logic prescribes ontology. It's that we look at how logic is shaped and we realize, oh, these have to be the ontological preconditions for us to think logically in this way. That's what he's saying. And same thing with any discussion of history or any discussion of the Trinity as well. So I think what you're saying is really good, that you can't separate the parts from each other.
This is what's interesting to me. Your book made me really. What's funny, I've been dialoguing about the book with a mutual friend of ours who shall remain nameless, and he'll know when he listens to this, because he's, we've been dialoguing about just how important Christianity is for Hegel and for you, and how it. But there's something about Christianity and its Trinitarian framework that does justice intuitively to what you write about in a way that simple monotheism doesn't. Whether it's a simple monotheism of natural theology, or whether it's a simple monotheism of Judaism or Islam. I mean, Karl Barth says that to say God is one is not to say that oneness is God. And this sense that this perspectival nature if reality is such that you can never have anything discretely or abstractly, purely, that everything is always, as you're saying, in relationship, right? Just when you try to think of the most independent thing, and you'll wind up seeing how it's connected to everything else ultimately.
Exactly.
Right? And you're always teasing out these contradictions and these tensions and these negations and things. But it seems like, how would you get a world like that from a being that didn't know that? Right. And so if the creation story begins with a God that knows dialectic in its own being, in his own being, in the divine being, if that's basic, then it makes sense that, creation would be the mirror of that, the image of that, because what if we see all this stuff, all over, whether in the psyche or music or in the physical nature of the tree and the kitten, you write all this about all this stuff. If that's everywhere, then God must be something like this dialectic, or else how would the whole reality echo it?
Right. How could a God that had perfect unity or oneness ever create anything? Right? It couldn't create things like if you think of God like Hegel does, then all these theological problems, I think, evaporate, right? Like, how does sin come into the world if God, like that? Of course it comes into the world because God is already divided against itself. That's why creation is even possible, right? If you don't, and that, again, that comes back to this logic and ontology thing, right? Because you're thinking, how is our logic, what conditions it? What makes it possible? What makes all of the world possible if it wasn't a divided God? And I think if you think of a divided God or a Trinitarian version of God, then it seems to me much easier to think creation without this abstraction of, okay, God is on the one side and then creation's on the other side, right? Because God has to be, even in Genesis, God is intervening, right? So it is a little, I think it's the Jewish concept, Hegel would say, the Jewish conception of God is even contradicted by the Genesis account of creation, because once God speaks, then already the game is over, because you're a subject of the signifier. You're already lacking. You're already contradictory.
Yeah, I love the lacking, because you say, I mean, in some of your other work, that we don't come into the world base, right, at zero. We come in -1. We come in with birth trauma and struggle and finitude, and so you're always sort of behind the 8 ball a little bit. And some of the desire, whether it's consumerism, which we talked about in capitalism in your book about excess, and we've had so many of these conversations. But that's the game. You're coming in with Paradise Lost. You're kind of coming in behind the 8 ball, right? And you're desiring to square that, right? And what you're saying, it's provocative, right? And I think theism has struggled with this, but it post-Holocaust, it's been a little easier to say, but it's almost, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, I think, said somewhere, only the suffering God can help, right? And it's almost like only the God that also has lack can create and make sense of, and maybe even be anything that would be useful to navigate this world. It's the God.
Absolutely Hegelian point. Yes, absolutely true. I think that I totally agree with.
Now it's interesting I think one of the bad guys in the book. Okay, if we're making a screenplay, right? The bad guy is Captain Substance or something, right? This is what we're always looking for, right? We're always looking for something undivided. Whether you it's so interesting. You play Christian fundamentalism off of Richard Dawkins. What's more dialectical than that, right?
Yeah.
But what you're saying is that, right, I think what you're saying when you put them in conversation is they're both looking for the undivided, right? They're both looking for a simple story. They're both looking for a story where the truths don't do these damn things like I believe in universal inclusion. Oh, wait, except for I exclude the excluder. Yeah, that what fundamentalism you're saying does, what Dawkins does, what capitalism does, what communism does, they all are, where they trip up, right, is that I think they all, for you and for Hegel, are going after the undivided substance. And that's the thing. Right. You could just get to this one damn thing that's not conflicted, that's not in tension, and once you get that, that's gold, baby.
Right. Then all your problems are solved, right? And Hegel's point is you're never going to get there. Right? Because, and I think his answer about why is really interesting, because his point is, if you can get there, that proves that where you've gotten is already divided, right? Because it's accessible. And he has this fascinating line where he says, even animals are smart enough to know, they're smarter than these certain philosophers that think there is something substantial out there, because they just go out in the world and they take a bite out of the food that they want to eat, and they eat it, and so they know that the thing is not a thing in it. He's saying the animal is smarter than Kant, because Kant says, oh, there's a thing in itself, say an apple and whatever, and the dog just goes and takes a bite of the apple. So I don't know if dogs eat apples, but the point is that in the act of eating the thing, you're saying you're articulating in a way that it is also divided.
Yeah,
it's divided.
Right.
It's not me, but it's not whole. It's not substantial. Right. You're right. That substance is the bad word for me here. And it's interesting that philosophers prior to Hegel were constantly seeking something substantial as a way to find a basis for their philosophy. So that's the real difference. So someone like Spinoza thinks there's just one substance in everything. And so all divisions for Spinoza are in some way false. And Hegel just thinks that's crazy, because you could never grasp the way in which interactions have to happen. And the whole itself is contradictory, right? And Spinoza says, no, there's this all-encompassing whole. So it's like that. Do you remember that old Bette Midler song, From a Distance, There's Harmony? Yeah. Like that's the Spinozist view. Mm-hmm. And I think Hegel's view is, from a distance, it still sucks. There's still split, there's still contradiction, and you can't you can't avoid it no matter how much of a God's eye view you take, because the view you take from is going to also be, if you're able to see the other thing, that evinces that you're split and it's split. Otherwise, it wouldn't be available to you.
So I want to get back to the kittens for a second, because for some reason that's in my mind here, where you say you talk about in the middle of the book that how things like acorns don't fantasize about becoming oak trees, and kittens don't fantasize about becoming cats. But you say, while the subject has the ability to include its otherness in how it conceives itself, the acorn and kitten cannot. As a result, contradiction completely dominates them. It entails their absolute demise. The subject, in contrast, can reconcile itself with contradiction, finding itself in its own destruction. But when the subject considers itself and other entities as simply existing and space and time, it misrecognizes contradiction as difference. Then you say, this is great, the danger of thinking contradiction as difference is that it obscures how every entity is at odds with itself before it is at odds with others. Difference creates the illusion of the possibility of harmonious coexistence, which is why it is such an attractive position. Why should we choose contradiction over difference? Todd McGowan, why is contradiction? Why is difference? Everybody's selling difference. You're saying difference overrated. Contradiction is better than difference.
Yeah, that's probably the most controversial section of the entire book, for the reason you just said, right? Because difference is on sale today. It's highly prized, especially in a growing worldwide fascistic movement that seems to be trying to target difference. But I would say what it's trying to target first is contradiction, and then difference is sort of the fallout of that. Why? Because I think if you grasp, here's the difference, that contradiction is internal, and I think we think of difference as external. And then once you stop thinking in terms of contradiction and start thinking in terms of difference, then you fail to see the way in which, and I think this is so important, you yourself are part of every problem that you're involved in. Right? Like, no matter how, look, I'm not saying that people aren't oppressed or there aren't terrible situations that people are in, but, and this comes back to Freud, I think, in some way, that terrible, you're involved in that situation, right? Somehow something in you has made you able to be in that situation. And so that's the challenge that's Hegel's challenge for us to think. And if you don't think that, then what you think is, oh, if I just get rid of this difference, this bad situation, then things are going to be rosy. And I think that's the real danger. I see that as the grave danger, really. So I think, yeah. I
remember years ago, when I started listening to your podcast. I think this is after maybe I first had you on the show, and I began listening to Why Theory. I remember you had a discussion with your co-host Ryan about undocumented workers and immigrants, and you said it was. I remember it like it was yesterday, because it was. Now I understand it much better as I've learned Hegel through you. That you said, there's this narrative that's interesting. Like, you hear these two things in the immigration debate. Well, the immigrants, they're lazy and shiftless and sucking up all our benefits, and yet they're also industrious and quick and Speedy Gonzalez, and they're taking all the jobs. And you're saying the Kantian or these sort of ways have a well, how can these be true? But you're saying the Hegelian, oh yeah, because we're all both lazy and industrious. We're all both listless and energetic. We're all both. So what we see in that story of the immigrant is the story of all of us, right? And so we're all just, and what we're seeing when we're seeing these both sides of them is seeing both sides of ourselves.
Right, exactly. And I think if you just think about accepting difference, then you miss that, right? You miss the way in which you have to see in the difference, your difference from the other, your difference from yourself, right? Like, if you just think like, oh, I have to accept the immigrant, even if the immigrant is industrious, or even if the immigrant is late, then you miss the way in which what I'm seeing in the other is my own internal contradiction. And I think that's the real danger of thinking in terms of difference, right? Like it's a way of letting yourself off the hook, I think, like allowing you to get out of seeing the internal rift in yourself that is constantly condemning you to missing the thing that what we talked about as substance, to missing something that's like perfect, like some perfect solution. It's not the external situation that's causing us to miss the perfect solution. It's our own internal contradiction. And that's why, again, for me, contradiction, the turn from contradiction to difference, which I think has basically happened since Hegel died, like that move of toward, and then it ends in the apotheosis of difference in thinkers like Derrida, Jacques Derrida, and Gilles Deleuze, right? Like that's sort of the dominant way of, it's filtered down to the common way of thinking today. And I think that's this massive move away from Hegelian contradiction. And I think the political, the philosophical effects are deleterious, but I think the political ones are as well.
So what you're saying for people that aren't sort of eye high in continental philosophy or something, which is me, of course, too, but for people that don't, but they intuitively probably get this, right? The one thing an undergraduate learns, right, is that it's about pronouns, it's about difference, it's about that person's identity is so different than you because they're Latinx and lesbian, and you're Jewish and Ashkenazi, and that person is bisexual and Sephardic, and this person is a Mormon, and that's the most important thing, right? That you bracket everybody off, and then what means to be a good person is to know somehow that you can never understand that person because of that difference, and then hopefully that means you're nicer or something, and you fight for their rights because you're a good person, and difference makes you respectful. Somehow when you get how their difference, it makes you empathetic or something, or somehow makes you a better person, right?
Well, Scott, I like that you're having trouble articulating what the result of it is, because that's part of the problem with it, right? Like there's some kind of like moral imperative behind it, but it's not clear what kind of moral comportment it's trying to produce. I've never understood it. Like, because you're not allowed to articulate, this is tied to this philosophy of difference. You can't articulate any universal moral principle. Like we should always treat, like a normal Kantian thing, right? We should always treat others not just as means, but also as ends in themselves, right? Okay, perfect. That's not part of the philosophy of difference. So I think that the trouble articulating what the goal is part of the point. But I think what it does is it we were talking about this before, right? And what it does is it turns every other into a substantial figure, like they just are that thing, right? But it's not true, right? Like if like what am I? Am I like purely, I don't know, I'm a university professor, but none of whatever all the things that I am, I'm never purely those things, right? Like
this is the Whitman. You mentioned the Whitman, although tease that a little bit. It's in it, but the I contain multitudes, right?
Yeah. Right. It's like you're at odds with. Right. Whitman is a bad Hegelian, but he's saying what he's saying is right, that you're at odds with yourself, and I think the philosophy of difference is an attempt to try to. There, you see all the ways they're trying to correct for that, right? Like intersectionality, whatever. But I think all those ways still fail to grasp this internal contradiction within every subject, and that when you're relating to that, like it's nice to think, oh, that other is just whatever, whatever the other, like that other is heterosexual, Jewish, whatever, blah blah blah. And thus I'm completely separate from that. But again, in order to even identify them in that way, I'm not completely separate from them. I'm involved in them. And I'm that contradiction within them is also within me. And I think that the need to grasp that is so, so important, because the other kind of that liberal utopia that you mocked in the very beginning, I think that's the dead end that position runs into. And I always come back to this Hillary Clinton, the only people that oppose me are a basket of deplorables, right? Like, we think, oh, what a screw up. She just shouldn't. No, she had to say that, right? Like, that's essential to the position of liberal tolerance, right? That there always are going to be people that aren't on board, that are in this basket of deplorables,
the inclusive church isn't for everybody, right?
It's not for right? Exactly. So I think once you and that's the way that is a position that doesn't grasp its internal. It thinks like, oh, we're open to everything, but it doesn't grasp the way it's founded on an internal contradiction that every gesture of inclusion is fundamentally limited. This is why I think the notion that this idea that we can include everyone or everyone, no one is illegal, all these kind of, I find all those statements sort of risible, because I think any efforts, I think this is a Hegelian point, any effort at universal inclusion is always going to run into that problem of the church you mentioned, right? So I think Hegel's solution is the opposite one of universal. None of us, we all don't belong, right? Like, that's what we have. That's what's universally shared by all of us, our contradiction, the way we lack, the way we don't fit in. And I think if you've ever been to a party, it's intuitive almost, right? Like you look around, you're like, wow, everyone else looks like they're really fitting in here. But everybody's saying that to themselves, right? Everybody's saying, oh, everyone else looks like they're really fitting in, while I don't feel like I do. But if you realize, no, everybody's saying that, then it changes the whole dynamic, I think.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think about the whole substance thing, right? That substance is this thing that that's the thing that would make you feel not alienated at the party, or that's the thing that would make me feel not alienated at the political right. You think, and I think about Donald Trump and the way he talks in substance, right? And I remember one of the rallies, he's like, "We love your Second Amendment. We protect Second Amendment." Right? What's more substantial than that language? Right? The Second Amendment now is not a concept in a document. It's this thing that we're protecting. It's a substance, right? It's reified. It's got this reality to it, right?
Right. I think he's a great figure of appealing to people with the promise of substance, while he himself is such a contradictory figure, right? Like, you can see him like suffering the pains of contradiction. I mean, I'm not saying I feel bad for him, but it's really, you can see it's a real struggle, because he has to constantly invoke substance to try to escape this abyss of his own, the contradiction that he's suffering from. So I feel like you can really see it in him, the way that he's trying to escape this thing that he can't ever escape from. And I think you're right that the constant invocations of something substantial, like even Make America Great Again, is a call for, let's return to a substantial America, right? But he'll never give an exact date of when that is, because of course, once you put a date on it, we can say, well, wait a minute, there was already at that time, like when was it? Let's say 46, 47. Well, okay. Communist infestation of America at that time, right? So there's not, it's hard, it'd be impossible for him to be precise because of that.
I can tell you when the date was.
Okay, good.
It was 1985. It was pre-1985, because that's when Coke changed its formula. It was the new Coke.
There you go. I can buy
did.
that.
Look, we had the old Coke. It was so strong. The Coke that you had and we had, like, it was like white Coke. I mean, not like the drugs, but I mean, Coke for white people. And then, the people in the trans come in with the Coke, and the illegals. Okay, very sad, strongly. And then you have Bad Bunny, when we could have a Christian Easter Bunny. Very good, very strong.
Perfect.
It's it just make no sense. That's what I learned with the Trump impression.
It's great, but I do think, I mean, that's a great thing, right? That classic Coke becomes classic Coke only when it's lost by the creation of new Coke, right?
See, you can Hegelianize soda. You're the master. What's the sound of one hand clapping? Here it is. Yeah, but and you see it too. It's not just on the right? I mean, Bill Maher was saying something on his show. I was watching his show, the show from last Friday, and he had Warnock on and Larry Wilmore, and he said, "Look, the Democrats. Look, he was talking about the Democratic Socialists who just wanted it. And the one woman is saying, look, we're not going to. We shouldn't incarcerate murderers, and there's no cops, and there's no." And this becomes another form of substance, right? That we're going to create conditions on the ground where there'll be no more conflict, and we won't need the unpleasant things of the state that we sort of. And again, you talk about the two things that people dispose of with Hegel that kind of sort of smooth, take off the corner, try to square the circle, is Christianity and the state, right? And you these things that there's this substance pie in the sky thing on the left, right? That will come in and we'll change the facts on the ground, and we won't have a conflicted society anymore, right? And that's another form of substance.
Absolutely. I think that the state is so crucial for. I mean, whatever. It doesn't care. I don't care what you call it, like state, some kind of collective organization, right? But I think it's so crucial to Hegel because it's the thing that allows the contradiction to become evident within the whole, because precisely because it's bureaucratic, right? Like it's this stupid institution that is clearly in the way of social harmony, and I think this is the crucial thing, it's absolutely necessary for the possibility of any sociality at all. And so he doesn't think, the idea of the withering away of the state or something like that, would be silly to him. And I agree. I think that was one of the silliest thing. I mean, I was sad that person won. That seems like one of the silliest things that when leftists say that, I think that you pave the way to Trumpism, right? Like that seems like just a silly kind of thing. And I actually, I mean, my and I think I just have and this is probably the influence of Hegel, but I'm a very strong. I mean, I'm a total leftist, but I think the state is absolutely crucial for any kind of emancipatory project. I don't think it's the enemy of that. So I think that's again, if we've talked this whole time about the move away from Hegel throughout, history since him, that seems to me one of the main ways, the way in which the left has become, at least parts of it, very hostile to the state. Unlike during the New Deal, right? Like the state was the source of even as late as Johnson, the state was the source of hope for people. So I feel like I think it's probably with Vietnam that things, at least in the U.S., started to change.
Yeah, and in your work, I mean, you talk about the public, right? Things like parks and subways and buses, where you get out of your cul-de-sacs of particular communities and you rub, and there is real sociality, right? The state is, without the state, we wouldn't have
any of that. We just have our little private communities, right? Like I feel like that's another. The apotheosis of community seems to me, again, part of the same anti-state problem.
Todd, you say, page 149 of Emancipation After Hegel, you can get wherever books are sold. We discover freedom through the means we use to accomplish our unfree ends. We discover freedom through the means we use to accomplish our unfree ends. What means are you using to accomplish your unfree ends? Tease that sentence out. Where do you live this out in your life?
Okay. So let's take an example. Like I'm earning my daily bread being professor, right? Like, so there's no freedom in that necessarily. Like, I mean, maybe I chose that job, maybe I didn't, I don't know. But the point is that when I do it, when I follow, and this is about the relationship between freedom and necessity, when I follow this necessary thing, I end up doing things that and this is we were talking a little bit about the relationship between Hegel and psychoanalysis. I think this is one of the key ways that I end up doing things that undermine my advancement. And for Hegel, that's where I find my freedom, right? Like I find my freedom not in doing my job the best I can or whatever, but in actually in the ways that I deviate from that when I'm not advancing my career. I always think of this line from Orson Welles where the interviewer was asking him, he said, how do you feel about, are you worried when you make a film like Citizen Kane that you're going to alienate the more conservative members of your audience? And this is a great answer. He said, I don't think I'm God's gift to politics. He goes, but it's just that if I feel strongly about something, I'm not going to balk on it. And then he says, I never viewed my career as something so precious that it had to come before my convictions. And I just thought, well, that's kind of what I'm saying in that statement, right? Like that you're necessarily following your career advancement, but then you deviate from it because of your convictions in a different direction. I was just reading, maybe you read it was in the Times this morning, about how celebrities are no longer speaking out because they're afraid that they'll lose they won't get any more film contracts in the era of Trump. And I just thought that Wells line just came to mind. And I thought, wow, filmically we've fallen so far from him, but also just as a political figure. I mean, he was standing up to McCarthy and whatever he was willing to risk and lost a lot. So it's just interesting that's kind of gone. But that's sort of what I mean by that. But that you're following, in the process of following the thing that you think is going to advance yourself, you end up doing things this is where I think the link to Freud, you end up doing things unconsciously that are, or maybe consciously, but that are assertions of your freedom.
You're talking about freedom in Hegel. It's very interesting. I was watching something, came up on Facebook or something, a reel or something about, and there were these British scholars, and they were asking why they don't really teach the American Revolution in British schools. And this person said, it's not that we have this antagonistic view to it. It's that it just doesn't seem as earth-shattering to us as the French Revolution, right? That these agrarian guys who are declaring self-evident truth doesn't seem as significant as the French Revolution, and for all of its excesses or whatever, that is the looming thing, and that is the looming thing for Hegel, right? I mean, the French Revolution,
absolutely, right? There's no other event. So there's a couple of great things. I end the book with as you'll probably remember, with a story I say it's probably not true, but
yeah.
It should be true.
The freedom tree, or
that in 1793. Right at the height of the terror, on July 13th, Schelling, Hölderlin, and Hegel planted a liberty tree and danced around it and drank and sang La Marseillaise. Probably not true. But subsequent to that, every July 13th, he drank a toast to the French Revolution, no matter where he was. And I was reading another party. He loved to go to parties. And he was at a party, and he popped open a champagne, and his students are like, whose birthday is it? He's like, what? He couldn't, it was just shocked him. He said, you don't know what day it is? It's July 13th. And so that event just shaped shaped his philosophy totally. And I think his philosophy is an attempt to make that event philosophical. You know what I mean? To grasp the philosophical import of that event. And it is interesting that the French Revolution has this weight that even though the American comes first, it just doesn't have the same weight. The only person that tries to say the American, maybe not the only one, but the only one I know, is the major figure, is Superior's Hannah Arendt in her book on revolution. She says the American one is the one. But I think for Hegel, it's the French and then it's the Haitian, because the Haitian is this incredible moment where the same values of the French Revolution are articulated by slaves, and they free themselves. So I feel like that the impact of that on him just can't be overstated, because it's his attempt to it pushes him to think, okay, we can, for one thing, we don't have to be.
I lost your volume there, Todd. Did you? I lost your volume. Can't hear you.
Okay.
There you go. Perfect.
Okay. Sorry. So that for him is the great moment, that we don't have to be ruled by tradition in the French Revolution. That's what the French Revolution articulates, right? Can you hear me?
Yeah, I got you.
You got me. Okay. So again, his philosophy is trying to make sense of that, trying to see how that can be made into a philosophical system, what the French Revolution discovers. And I think what's interesting for him, and obviously he didn't know the Russian Revolution, but they had a roadmap, and the thinkers of the French Revolution, they were just figuring it out as they were going, basically based on Rousseau's philosophy, but these ideals of freedom, equality, and solidarity, those were they wanted to articulate them, but they had no idea how. So I think that moment in time is just, it's interesting that he is in the seminary when that happens, and then it's utterly shaping for him.
So the revolution takes him away from the seminary into philosophy. I mean,
I think so. I think that it's hard to say, because he might not have. So the seminary was basically the way for someone like him to get out of just being a public servant or a peasant or whatever he would have done, right? So he had a scholarship there. It's not clear if he ever really wanted to be a minister. So, and that's probably true of Hölderlin and Schelling too, that they went as an escape from. It's not like they could have gone to the university. Like, this was sort of what they had instead of going to the university. So, but yeah, I think that made him much more secular, that event.
Let me ask you this. So I'll tell you, there's this book out, Let Them, by Mel Robbins, right? And this is a book that's so popular today. I don't know if you know the book. I don't know. Mel Robbins is a person with a podcast. It's got, I don't know, a zillion listeners. Certainly not, certainly not quite the level of Y Theory, but it's a ubiquitous podcast, and she does, all the rounds and all the big shows and things. She's been on Bill Maher, she gets the Pivot, all the podcast. But basically, it's a poor person's approach to Stoicism, right? She read a little Stoicism, and that's the making the rounds today, right? Everybody in pop figures, Jerry Seinfeld, Tim Ferriss, Mel Robbins, everybody's saying, well, really the thing to do therapeutically for yourself, you want to get into philosophy, get into Stoicism. For you, okay, why would Hegel be a better option? Why pick up a little alienation text by Todd McGowan or something? Why dip your toe into the waters of Hegel as opposed to doing what everybody else is doing and running after Stoicism?
Okay, Scott, I'm so glad you mentioned that. So I guess I've heard of Mel Robbins. I've definitely heard of Jerry Seinfeld.
Why read Hegel?
That's very good. I've definitely heard of Stoicism. And if there is one, I'm glad we're going to talk about this, because if there's one philosophy that Hegel hates, it's Stoicism. And he'll often talk about and he equates it with, so the worst thing he can say about someone is that they're monkish. So this monkish kind of, he'll say a monkish timidity, because, and that's equated with Stoicism, because he thinks Stoicism is an attempt to retreat from the world, right? And to say, and I think this is why the world seems so bad. This is why everybody wants to retreat from it today, right? Because they think, well, at least inside I'll have this internal peace. Well, we've already talked about why that wouldn't be true, because inside there's just as much of a contradiction as there is outside. That's the number one problem. Number two problem is, there's three problems, I think. Number two problem is, what is the so Hegel thinks to himself, this is the second chapter of the first chapter of the self-consciousness section of the Phenomenology of Spirit. It's just on Stoicism. He says, what's the content of what is the Stoic thing? Like, you're abstracting yourself from everything in the world, but what is dominating your thought? Everything that's happening in the world, right? All you have in your thought is this thing you're trying not to think about, which is coming from the external world. So it's a fake retreat because you're actually relying on the thing. This is kind of what we've been talking about the whole time. You're relying on the thing you're retreating from. And the third thing, and this is the biggest thing, is that he thinks it's a great, do you know the film Total Recall? Where,
yeah, sure.
Okay.
Both of them,
yeah. Well, okay. I don't think this is in the second one, where the mutant gets open in the guy's chest.
Yeah.
And he says to Arnold Schwarzenegger, or is his name, it's not Dennis Quaid, is it? It's Quaid.
Quaid, yeah.
It's not Dennis Quaid, it's someone else. He says, Quaid says that, he goes, who am I? I'm nothing really. And the guy, and then this Guido, or I forget his name, the mutant says, you are what you do, right? And I think that is the ultimate, and Hegel says this in a variety of ways, 100 times in his thinking, that if you are what you do, then this stoical retreat from the world is it's fake. It's fake because you're actually, in retreating from the world, enabling the world to be like it is in this way that you think is unacceptable, but you're helping to make it happen in your retreat from it. So that's why I would say it's an absolutely not just unadvisable position. I think Stoicism is an inexcusable position, actually, to take, because I think it's a way of trying to opt out that keeps things going and acts like it's uninvolved, but it's really keeping things going. So I think, to me, that's the number one. I'm almost convinced that this stoical retreat is worse than the very thing that's ruling us today. I'm almost convinced of that, because I think it's the thing that helps it happen. It helps it go on, because you just retreat and you let it go on. So
it's interesting. It's a great place to bring us to a conclusion, I think, because your book is contra this conception that Hegel is quietistic, right? That Hegel, there's that great, you talk about the phrase, the real is the rational is the real, and this sort of, what you would argue, I think, and you do argue in the book compellingly, that this quietism picture of Hegel, this picture of Hegel as the philosopher of the status quo, as the philosopher of acceptance of the inevitabilities of history or something, you say that's absolutely not Hegel, that this is a liberative thing, that this Hegel that rejects substance and rejects the stability that, substance as a sort of intellectual and existential security blanket, that when you get that Hegel, right, you have liberative possibilities, because you can reimagine political arrangements, you can you see beyond the substance of the people that want to give you simple answers and to reality that will make for repressive and non-liberative realities, right? That's your Hegel.
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. And I think in a way that the real is actual, the actual is real, is his way, or sorry, the rational is actually actual is rational, is his way of impelling us to think the contradiction and thus change it, right? It's a kind of call to theorize things. He thinks if we theorize things in the right way, we're going to impel a kind of social change. So that's when he supposedly was this court philosopher of Prussia, his courses were monitored by the authorities. His students were being arrested. So it's not like, it's very clear he was considered a dangerous force in the society. So it's not the idea that, he's this conservative, quietist figure. It's laughable, actually. Like he was in real danger as a thing. I mean, he was a little like, you know how de Gaulle said about Sartre, one doesn't arrest Voltaire when he was. I mean, it was a little like that. Like he was so well known. But his students weren't safe, and he was constantly trying to do things to protect his students. So I feel like that's probably the one charge against him that I really try to take on.
So it's interesting because Marx says that he says something akin to, I thought the purpose was to change the world, not to understand it, right? But for Hegel, it seems like, as you tease this out, that it would be something more like to understand the world is to change it.
Yes.
That the change comes through theory, through understanding. And this is why you've committed, is this why you've committed so much of your life to theorizing, to theories? Because that's where change happens, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, maybe that's wrong, but I believe that. Yeah.
So the very act of understanding something, the very act of coming up with why things are and with theorizing, that is change itself for you.
Right.
Inseparable from social change.
Inseparable. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, if that's the case, then I hope that this conversation has done something to make some liberative change. And I want everybody that's listening to grab Emancipation After Hegel, because reading it will be something that you can do to change social arrangements, make the world a little bit of a better place, because it made my life a little better reading it and talking with you about it.
Scott, it's always amazing to talk to you. Thanks so much for having me.
I had a great time. Thanks. We'll do it again.